Well, I can promise you a lot of bad news, which I'm sure you wish to hear. You would also like to hear what the bad news actually is, how many varieties there are running loose today in the jungle out there, and what the chances are for changing this. We are now at the end of things. Tomorrow, the President of the United States, so-called, is going to presumably make an address to a joint session of the Congress, and a joint session may mean a marijuana fest, as far as I understand, because people are it's going to have that kind of effect. There's no competence in this president. There never has been, and there was never intended to be. This president is a joker who was played upon the American people with a lot of drug money behind it, and he was never intended that he would be competent. He is totally incompetent. He's not a man of intellect. He's a man who's trained to babble, and he's been taught the recipes to babble. He has no comprehension of what he's talking about. But however, he is the elected president of the United States. And you cannot have coups at this time because the danger is already, there are too many threats of coup d'etats already around. And the system is set up for overthrows of governments, including the United States government. For example, right now, as you may recall, that when certain interests in London and the United States set up what became known as 9/11, as an operation run as a Saudi-British operation with cooperation of certain people inside the United States. And that's documented. That's a fact. This thing was funded by a British-Saudi operation in which the ambassador of Saudi Arabia to the United States was a key figure in preparing what became known as 9/11. At the time, there were many indications of what that was, but this was quickly hushed up. And the investigations, even as far as they went, were blocked. Certain facts were blocked out. But the evidence was always there, and all you had to do was to look in the right place. And it's there. It came from an alliance between Saudi Arabia and London, which financed and planned the entire operation. And the Saudi ambassador to the United States at that time was a key figure in setting up the operation. Now, this information was accessible to the incumbent government of the United States at that time. But it was hushed up. And something else which had been intended was done instead. The intention was to destroy this government. How? From the inside. And you had an idiot who was an unreconstructed drug addict, a cocaine freak, who had avoided military service in Vietnam by being co-opted into the Texas Air Guard. The Texas Air Guard didn't want him, but the Bush family forced him upon the Texas Air Guard. This fellow continued his habit, which included cocaine, a serious cocaine habit, and the head of the Texas Air Guard and company shipped this guy out to another state where he was supervised by a couple of military officials to go through drug treatment for cocaine addiction. And he went through a year of training and as cure for cocaine addiction, which didn't work. Right? So we had a coke addict who entered the White House as President of the United States, an unreconstructed coke addict, and who just could not drink alcohol except near beer. And he was nothing. Mean character, a mean little jerk, but no brains to speak of. The father was not too bright either. The brains in the family had been used up by the grandfather, who had been a key man in putting Hitler into power in Germany. And you're dealing with this kind of process, Anglo-American process all the way through, still to the present day. So now we have, after 2 terms of this idiot, under Cheney, we have an Obama administration. And despite the fact that Obama, when he was running as a candidate for president, campaigned against the unitary executive, that nonetheless, he, when he became president, became very quickly an advocate of the unitary executive, which is fascism minus a burning of the Reichstag. In other words, this schnook was put in as president. He fumbled around for a period of time. Then a crisis came. He kissed the British butt, who owned the people who really owned him. And that's how we got to this unitary executive. We now have signing statements from the President of the United States. We have a unitary executive, which was set up as a reaction to the bombing in New York, especially, 9/11. We're set up into a dictatorship in which the Congress no longer has the legislative power to control the presidency. Our system of government has gone to a unitary government under which the Congress is allowed to vote as long as they don't contradict the president. If they do contradict the president, he'll make a signing statement and say, yes, you in the Congress, you voted this way, but I, as President of the United States, think differently, and I'm going to act differently. And we have a dictatorship in the United States, which is in the direction of a Nazi dictatorship, under a president who doesn't have any problem with conscience because he doesn't have any brains. He's trained to talk like a training monkey or something out of a mechanical zoo. And is stumbling along. But he's still the president. Now, we in the United States are smart enough to know we don't make coup d'etat. We don't assassinate our presidents as a way of changing government, though we have some imported people who do that for us from time to time, as in the case of McKinley, which is a very crucial assassination, or the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, or the assassination of John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy, of course, is the watershed for this matter. They killed him. Why? Kennedy had 2 points on which he was hated by the Wall Street crowd and the London crowd. Number 1, on the question of the conflict over the steel industry, to defend American industrial power. And he made it stick, and he was going to continue to make it stick. Secondly, he opposed the insistence of the Wall Street crowd on going into a war in Indochina while he was president. And for that, he died. Imported assassins directed from Europe by way of Spain and by way of Mexico did the job. He scooted while somebody came up with a funny story to distract attention from everything. But why was he killed? The obvious reason became obvious in the next period after his death. When President Johnson, as Johnson later admitted, had been so terrified by the fact that these 3 riflemen who killed the Kennedy president were going to aim into his neck too, as he said at the end of his term in office. And therefore, when the issue came up of what Kennedy had done under the advice and counsel of former General MacArthur and the support of General Eisenhower, had objected to and opposed any launching of U.S. troops into Indochina. And the policy of MacArthur and Eisenhower, the policy adopted by Kennedy, was no U.S. land war involvement in Asia. That U.S. troops cannot handle warfare in Asia because Asian culture is not like European culture. And you're going to run into a different kind of problem. And it's not the way to deal with it in the first place. Because what you were doing, you were going on the side of British-controlled colonialism, imperialism, against the people of Asia. And if you have a country which is associated with a European standpoint, like the United States, culturally, goes into a war against Asians, what are you going to get in Asia? You're going to get a reflex. And that's what we got. And the British have always handled us nicely by getting us into wars in places like Asia. This is the way the British run the world. The British Empire runs the world through warfare. The same way they got imperial power by inducing the silly nation states of Europe to go to war to each other in the so-called 7 Years' War. And the leading nations of Europe went to war against each other for 7 years, while the British stood on the sidelines and encouraged the process and laughed. And then on February in 1763, in the Peace of Paris, the British Empire was declared as the empire of a private company called the British East India Company. And the British East India Company took over what had become the United Kingdom and has run it from that time to its equivalent, the present day. The British East India Company, of course, went into bankruptcy at a later period. There were changes made, as under Victoria, and so forth, but the principle remained the same. The British East India Company represented a special kind of empire, which is the only kind of empire we've known in the whole history of European civilization. The empires of European civilization were based on the destruction of Greece through self-destruction in the Peloponnesian War, where the monetary interests centered on Venice, the war against the monetary interests centered on the city of Corinth, the Peloponnesian War. And then later, when not satisfied with that spot of self-destruction, the combined forces of Greece went to war against Syracuse, the third maritime power of the Greek-speaking Mediterranean. And thus a power from Asia, from the Asian tradition, called the cult of Delphi, went through a process of organizing an empire under its control, which later became, by a special agreement, so arranged, the Roman Empire of Octavian, otherwise known as Caesar Augustus. Now, in all this process, what has run the world as an empire, since these developments in a maritime power, that is, we'd had empires in Asia before. The idea of empire comes from Asia, it does not come from Europe. But it was introduced to Europe by this process, by the Peloponnesian War, that vehicle. And since that time, we have had an empire of a maritime characteristic, that it was originally based on the maritime power of the Mediterranean Sea, and later spread to the Atlantic Ocean. A maritime power which had created a control over the use of money. And the basis of this power was money, the control of money as a form of imperialism. All European imperialism, including British imperialism today, is not based on a landed territory. It's based on an international organization of the control of money. Now, this money is actually controlled by private interests, by individuals who form concerts of private interests who set up the control of money, its creation and management. And nation states are subsidiary to this international control of money. The British Empire, which evolved out of this process, is nothing but that. It is not an empire of the people of the United Kingdom. It is an empire of an international consortium of these types of interests whose control over money is used by use of the control of money to control nations. The one case in which this was not successful was the formation of the United States. And the United States was actually created, especially from the course of the 17th century on. It was created initially by a colonization in New England, by the Plymouth colony and then by the Massachusetts Bay colony. And this was the keystone, the kernel of creating what became the United States. These people who came on the Mayflower or came to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and they came from various parts of Europe, not just English-speaking, but came into this area, came here because they saw Europe as a hopeless cause, that the corruption of Europe is so bad that they could not solve the problem of Europe there. They had to go across the sea, as had been recommended by a great person, Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa, earlier, to continents across the oceans, to carry the best of civilization across the oceans into new territories, to meet new people, and to set up a civilization which would be free of the colonialist or imperialist evils of Europe. And that started in Massachusetts in that form. And we had the beginning of a different alternative system of finance called a credit system, which was established in the middle of the 17th century in Massachusetts by a system of scrip, which is later referred to as a paper money system by Benjamin Franklin, and is the characteristic of the U.S. federal Constitution. The U.S. federal Constitution does not condone a monetary system of the type that we have had particularly under the Federal Reserve System, which was an act of treason against the United States in the first place, because it destroyed us as a credit system and made us the subject of an international monetary system rather than a credit system. Our Constitution specifies to this day, and this is crucial for us here today to take into account, our Constitution specifies that we are not a monetary system, and we are not the subject of a monetary system. We are a credit system as our Constitution defines it, and as the history behind that Constitution defines it. The only authorization for the circulation of money inside the United States or any other respectable nation is an act of the state, not the going of the state to some international private monetary complex to which the state goes into debt. And this issue of debt is crucial. Our debt is out by our will, and it's our debt to ourselves, or by treaty agreements with other countries on nation-to-nation agreements. And that is the principle we must apply if we're going to save civilization now. We've come to a point that the monetary system, or the monetarist system, which is based on international financier interests, not nation states, international financier interests, which call free trade. What does free trade mean? It means free of government supervision. It means free of all government supervision. It means a world planet government by private financier interests operating as a consortium of monetarist interests. So always the issue has been that. It was the issue on the death of Roosevelt. On the 12th of April of 1945, the United States was operating under a credit system. As of April 12th, 1945, the United States post-war policy under Roosevelt was to set up a worldwide credit system, not a monetary system. The United States would organize in cooperation with other nations as treaty agreements, would set up an international credit system using the power which we had mobilized for military purpose of production, to use the power of the United States to produce the goods, which would then be the engineer for freeing people from colonialism, freeing them from subjugation, and reorganizing Europe on the basis of an international credit system, which had been the intent and the explicit intent of Franklin Roosevelt at the famous Bretton Woods Conference, where he had rejected Keynes and attacked Keynes and rejected him, knowing that this was the British imperial system of Keynes. And the United States and the people of the world must be freed once and forever from monetary system and have the power of a system of sovereign nation states, which would have partnership with their respective credit systems in cooperation. That was Roosevelt's intention. On the day that Roosevelt died, and his successor, Harry S. Truman, no middle name, S, is an S man, took over. He kissed Churchill's butt, and we did everything pretty much wrong since that point on. We've had patriots who have lurched sometimes in the direction of trying to reestablish the influence of the United States despite the fact of the international monetarist system. Because the international monetarist system places the United States among other nations as the victim of international private interests, not governments, and the control over the idea of money by international private banking interests, not governments. Whereas under the American system, only a sovereign nation state and a partnership among sovereign nation states should be allowed to have such power. And that's the crux of the problem now. Today, for example, in the summer of 2007, on the 27th of July, in premises akin to these today, I set forth a policy to deal with a crisis which was immediately oncoming. I said that we were on the brink of a breakdown of the world system, specifically the U.S. system, and that we had to take certain measures, that our banks were bankrupt, and we had to go through a process of reorganization and bankruptcy by using the power of the federal government to declare bankruptcy, especially in respect to mortgages. That is, to freeze all mortgages pertaining to people who occupied the residence which was mortgaged. And to protect the banks, which in many cases were already bankrupt, to protect those banks by a Glass-Steagall standard. If we put this forth in the form of a motion, a proposal, which circulated widely with wide support throughout the United States, the Homeowners and Bank Protection Act of 2007, if that act had been actually introduced, it was introduced on many levels and supported by many parts of the population and institutions of the United States, including states. If that had done, we wouldn't be in a mess today. Well, what happened? During the course of September of 2007, Barney Frank, who was not the nicest person on the planet, and Chris Dodd, otherwise known as a Dodderer, came to agreement to block the Homeowners and Bank Protection Act, despite the large support it had throughout the United States among popular parts of the state organizations and so forth. Had that act been carried through, we would not be in this mess today. But what happened? Why did Christopher the Dodderer and Barney Frank, and he's frankly something special, why did these guys get the support and become the instruments in the Congress to destroy the United States by blocking this? And what did they do? What they did, which became clear in the following year, 2008, what became clear was a process leading to bailout. What we did, we had the whole Wall Street and similar kinds of international financier operations around the world were at that point bankrupt. That was the key problem here. Instead of putting these things through bankruptcy reorganization, we bailed out the bankers of the world at the expense of the American population. Now today, because of the trillions of dollars of theft by the Bush administration and the President Obama administration, we have a lack of the means to meet the needs of our own population. And we've engaged in both a shutdown over these months since September of 2007. We've engaged in a process of destroying the employment and conditions of life and security of the people of the United States, all for the purpose of the looting of those people, the taking away of their employment, in the service of honoring the artificial debt of a bunch of crooked swindlers associated with Wall Street, with the firm of Goldman Sachs, which is, this is the thing we deal with. So what we now have is a particular crisis of this president. This president is a butt kisser for the financial interests internationally. Why is he about to kiss her? Because the British Queen told him to be. He has no mind of his own. He's educated to memorize speeches, whose content he does not understand. The implications of whose content he has no understanding whatsoever. And he's simply the hired fool who occupies the White House and was selected because he was a fool and is a fool, has remained a fool. What comes out of his mouth makes no sense. This man is not intelligent. He's a trained zoo animal who says things, who has great ambition. And lacking brain power, he has delusions of grandeur and assumes that he's the emperor. And this man has adopted, under encouragement, dictatorial powers of the type associated with what was attempted through 9/11 in the so-called signing statements and what happened in the course of the Iraq War and since. We're now implicitly under a dictatorship. Politically, we're at the last stage before the equivalent of a Reichstagsbrand. We're on the verge of a dictatorship in the United States, being pushed very soon. And soon is determined by the fact that at the end of this month and beginning of October, the fiscal year of the United States comes to a close. And these accounts have to be reconciled. And there's no money to reconcile these accounts. There is no source of income to keep the states, who are 48 to 49 of these states are already officially in bankruptcy. And there's no money from any source to take these states out of bankruptcy. The payments that are not being made will never be paid under Barack Obama. There will never be any improvement in the conditions of life under Barack Obama, because Barack Obama, his administration, is directed under British direction to maintain the interests of the international financier interests, the monetarist interests, the monetary interests, not the United States. And therefore, Obama comes up with the British proposal for Hitler's, actually a carbon copy of the genocide policy of Adolf Hitler. And it is. And no matter how much the Obama people deny it, they are lying. The policy of Barack Obama is genocide against the people of the United States. That's a fact. And anybody who denies that fact is either kidding themselves or lying. If they're official, they're lying. That is the policy. And that's these people of the United States have over 60% of them have smelled that and picked on that as the leading reason for their opposition to the Obama administration. They know the guy is a Nazi. And pasting a toothbrush mustache on the upper lip of Obama, like that of Adolf Hitler, makes it very clear to Americans what this guy is. He's a puppet who is assigned to play the part of an Adolf Hitler in healthcare, because they cannot continue to bail out the thieves who looted this country and robbed it and also care for health care. They can't even apply ordinary employment without health care. We have 1/3 approximately of the population is actually unemployed, about 1/3 of which, of course, is not receiving anything in terms of compensation for unemployment. And there are others are running out of 52 weeks of unemployment compensation. So we have about 30% of the population is in destitute conditions who used to work for a living and have no hope. Many of them have given up hope. And as this October approaches, we're entering a period where a social catastrophe is about to occur. Why? Because President Obama is determined to bail out the system, even if it means killing Americans by his health care program. A health care program which is a copy of what Adolf Hitler introduced into Germany in 1939, in September, October 1939. There's not a single iota of difference between what Hitler did in 1939, 1940, and what Obama is dictating today. Not one bit of difference. obviously, one minimal condition which ought to be imposed, that every creep that's part of that Obama health care cabal should be thrown out of office immediately. Any official of government who says I'm wrong is a liar. He should also be thrown out of government. Because we've got to, look, we've got a situation, if we care as a nation, which represents a people, our population, we cannot have the destruction of the great majority of our people into a hopeless condition. And we're not going to do this to bail out some foreign predator. And the foreign predator is just going to have to do a little bit without. Because the great crisis today, which Obama is not talking about, and will not talk about tomorrow unless I scare him into doing it today, is that we've got to deal with the effects of this mass unemployment. And it's not just mass unemployment. Why are people unemployed? Because they're not producing. They have no opportunity to produce. Our industries have been shut down. Our agriculture is in a state of collapse. It's worse than that. It is something tantamount to treason. This name of this tantamount to treason is called globalization. Do you know what happened to this planet after 1968? After the spring and summer of 1968? It's called globalization. It came in the form of a fascist movement on the campuses which had the most privileged campuses of the United States. And they rose up, they tore off their shirts, waved their sexual organs, took dope, and marched out to live freedom forever. I saw this thing. I saw it at Columbia. It was in the universities in the United States and partly in Europe, which had the upper class so-called universities, in which there was these concentrations of people who were literal copies of the ancient cult of Dionysius, which is the model for fascism. Mark Rudd and company, like the Weatherman and so forth, were actually a fascist organization bred on the campuses of the most privileged students in the United States, whose incentive for this great uproar was not some good for humanity, but the fact that they were being denied what they thought was their exemption from military service in Vietnam. So it was on those universities where the greatest number of exemptions from draft service in Vietnam were provided. When the war got hot and they needed more troops, and they began to dip into these areas, so if the guy was not serious in the class and didn't keep up the highest grades, he was likely to be snapped up in the draft and shipped across and trained to what to do in Vietnam. This was the issue which provoked this fascist movement in the United States, which was typified by the Weatherman organization. And this Weatherman phenomenon then spread during the course of the early 1970s and beyond to become the movement which has taken over the policy shaping top-down of many of our leading institutions in the United States today. So now we have the green revolution, not the part of producing agriculture, because that also has gone under, but the green revolution of being against industry, against production. You got a human race which depends upon the increase of what's called energy flux density of power sources. We've gone from sunlight to burning shrubs, to burning coal, to burning coke, and so forth, up the scale to nuclear power and approaching thermonuclear fusion. The existence of the human race depends upon going to consistently higher energy flux densities, that is, higher concentrations of power. Today we reach the point that without nuclear fusion, nuclear fission and thermonuclear fusion, we cannot continue to sustain a world population of the present magnitude. let alone an increased magnitude. We cannot maintain the standard of living because what we're doing, on the one hand, which is not bad in a sense, we are looting and using up those resources on which we depend, which are the most richly concentrated. These are larger resources which are sort of laid down by dead bodies of animals and plants over many millennia. So now we go to the area where the dead bodies of these creatures repose, where minerals are more concentrated by biological processes, which concentrate these minerals, and we extract the minerals there, where they're most richly concentrated because of a biological process. We produce, our industry is based on richer levels of resources. Now, as we draw down those resources, there's still plenty of resources in the planet, but you have to get them. They're not lying at your doorstep. You have to go out and get them. This requires more work. This requires more power. And therefore, you constantly have to go to higher levels of power. So mankind's progress went, essentially, from burning of simple objects, and the distinction of man from apes as far as archaeology is concerned is generally a fireplace. We find something that looks humanoid and remains, and you wonder whether it's human or not. If you can find a sign of a fireplace where something was burned, as in cooking, or fire spot in that area, you say this thing was human, because only human beings use fire. So mankind's use of fire has defined the nature of man's economy, our ability to produce, our ability to rise above the level of baboons, has depended upon this principle of using fire. But as we use up some resources, we still have plenty of the same resources, but we have to get it. And to get it requires more power. It requires to make the not to lose productivity in getting these resources, we have to increase the power which we apply. So in that way, we have to increase our concentration of power. Now, what has happened? These fascists, like the Weathermen type, and there are similar kinds of depraved people around the world, have said, no, we're going back to green. We're going back to sunlight. Going back to wind power. I mean, they should really not eat those beans, but we should. Instead of realizing that we have to face the reality that mankind is changing the world we live in and should be changing the solar system fairly soon, too. We're changing that. And this requires going to more advanced scientific capabilities for mastering these forces, learning to control these higher energy flux density sources of power, and applying them. And by this means, we can improve the standard of living of our people. We can also more than overcome the apparent shortages we incur by sticking to a stagnant form of production. So we've gone away from that. We don't teach science in universities anymore, really. Or they teach something called science, but there's no devotion to a mission. Take World War II. We had a devotion to a mission. And therefore, the resources of scientific capability and engineering capability were drawn into a concentrated effort to enable us to produce the weapons by which we could win that war and supply the logistical support to conduct that war successfully. At the end of the war, by this means, we had achieved the greatest concentration of productive power the planet had ever seen. And Roosevelt's intention was that we would use that accumulation of power, which we'd use for military requirements, we simply would convert it to its natural occupation for civilian requirements, for advancement of technology, not waste it on war, but use it for these purposes. Roosevelt's intention was to free the people who had been on colonialized part of the world and help them to develop self-sufficiency and eliminate the British Empire and all other empires from this planet, in order to build up a planetary system of relatively sovereign nation-state governments of people, and to hope to establish world peace among republics by finding a common interest among the people of these various republics for cooperation. That was Roosevelt's intention for the United Nations, was to convert a colonialized, imperialistic world into a world of sovereign nation-states, American style, to give them the option of an American-style sovereign nation-state, and to build a bond among these nations of cooperation and not get suckers for the British game of controlling planets by getting people to kill each other in wars which somebody made up for them to fight. That was the point. And this was what has been destroyed. It was taken away from us by Truman on. Truman kissed the butt of Churchill, and that's where the whole process started. And now the world is playing the silly game. We are now going to new wars in various parts of the world on schedule, killing people for some cooked-up reason, and all for the benefit of the propagation of the British Empire. Why did we go into Iraq twice? There's no need to go in there. Why did we go into Vietnam? There was no need for us to go there. When I was in military service in Burma, at that time, where I was operating out of Missioner, we were actually supporting Ho Chi Minh in Indochina against the Japanese. And when the Japanese surrendered to U.S. forces, they took over. The U.S. government had joined with Ho Chi Minh in the liberation of Indochina from colonialism. What did Truman do? Truman gave the British backing of the United States to take the Japanese troops out of the camps and reconquer Indochina until the French could get there to take over. And a British agent operating with Truman's backing did that. So we reversed our policy for which we'd fought war, and we did it all over the world. We recolonized Africa. We recolonized or partially recolonized other parts of the world. We did not use our potential industrial power to enable these countries through machine tools and other things to begin to develop their own independence, true independence and self-sufficiency. And so what we did, we engaged in organizing British-style perpetual local warfare between so-called traditional rivals. And the British, as they had done in the case of the 7 Years' War back in the 18th century, played this situation so the United States, like a damn fool, would go off to fight one more war and bleed its own people to death and waste our material, all for the greater glory of the British Empire. And we're still doing that today. In Afghanistan, what a piece of idiocy that is. It's unconceivable idiocy. Blessed by Obama. It's insanity. And the error is crystal clear. This is insanity. So we get into this kind of situation. Today, obviously, we have to realize that we have been betrayed in a very profound way. That is, with Franklin Roosevelt's success as president and his leadership in World War II, we had opened the gates for a new world free of imperialism, free of these kinds of evils we're suffering today. With the death of Roosevelt on April 12th of 1945 and the inauguration of Truman, who was no good from the beginning, it was a stooge for Winston Churchill. The British Empire and their friends inside the United States, their allies, the same ones who had backed Hitler earlier. Remember, the whole Wall Street crowd had been backers of Adolf Hitler until Pearl Harbor. And Truman was one of them, one of that pack. And so when Roosevelt died, who was the representative of the great achievement of his administrations, Truman moved the British back in and Wall Street back in to play their games. Now, we have a very special role in world history as a nation. We were established as a European culture. We were established on the initiative of a great figure from the 15th century, Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa, who recognized that at that time that the situation in Europe was becoming hopeless culturally, that the great intentions of the Council of Florence were being sabotaged and were in danger. And he came to the conclusion that people in Europe had to think about going out across the oceans to make contact with other parts of the world and take the best features of European civilization with them to contribute to these continents. And thus, by defending the advances of European civilization in these other continents, would feed back into Europe and tilt the balance so that Europe itself could achieve its own proper intention. There were various efforts in this direction. Christopher Columbus was actually inspired specifically by the program of Nicholas Cusa, as in about 1480 AD, which he actually was able to carry out in his first voyage in 1492. But the Habsburg control of Spain and Portugal meant that the attempt to develop civilization in Central and South America was jeopardized by this influence. And so it was not until the 17th century, in the colonization in Massachusetts in particular, that the initiative occurred for the development of the United States. Our distinction in the world is precisely that, the heritage of that period. Our distinction is we formed on this continent a republic which contained the best representatives of European civilization, people who came here from various parts of Europe, in the leading part, not to flee from Europe, but to carry European culture into a new continent and develop here a kind of nation state, which would be an example for the restoration of some kind of decency to Europe. And thus we have this distinction between our British cousins, so-called, and ourselves, that for many of us, we are part of the same cultural origin as they are, but their system of government is fundamentally different than ours. And the difference is largely not in language, though there is some difference in the use of language and who we call what and what not. But the difference is essentially this ingredient, that we do not accept the oligarchical conception of society, which is characteristic of Europe. We demand our kind of society, which is based on the nature of the individual. And we represent, in large degree, the best of European culture brought here, but freed of the habit of oligarchism, of kissing the butt of Sir this and Sir that and Baron this and so that and so forth, that sort of thing. We don't believe in this idea of oligarchical social class. And that is the fundamental distinction. So we as a nation, an English-speaking nation by and large, are absolutely unique on the planet. And we are the greatest danger because we represent the autonomy of European culture to the use of European culture in Europe as a way of destroying humanity. That's why they want to destroy us. Now, this comes to the practical question. What are we supposed to do now? The whole debate by Obama's a liar. And I would call him a liar, really, if he were not an idiot. And how can you call an idiot a liar? I mean, that's really a problem. But his thing about my program or nothing, the guy's a complete fraud. I don't think he thought up the fraud himself because he doesn't think very well. But I think somebody told him that and he's repeating it. It's being whipped into place. He's saying we have to kill people, kill our citizens, because our economy can't afford to feed them. I say, well, Mr. President, you're kind of stupid, aren't you? That's not the problem. The reason we can't feed our population is the fact they aren't employed. You took away their employment. You took away their industries. You took away their agriculture. Well, why don't you give them back their jobs? Why don't you give them back their industries? Why don't you give them back their farms? Why don't you support their industry? Why don't you support their investment in their industry? Why don't you investment in their farms? Why don't you educate them for the new kinds of employment which are required today, which we could do? Why do you have them out in the streets with no education whatsoever? Why do you have blab school education instead of real education? These young guys coming out of school don't know anything. Why? Because they've been educated to be know-nothing. Huh? Why don't we go to the mission of where are the jobs? Hey, Mr. President, where are the jobs? Hey, Mr. President, where are the skills for those jobs? Hey, Mr. President, where are the industries to employ these people? Hey, Mr. President, where are the farmers, the prosperous farmers we used to have to employ these people? Where's the basic economic infrastructure to change the power of mankind, increase the power of mankind in this universe, Mr. President? You've got these people out there, the citizens. You want to kill them. You want to increase the death rate among them. You say there are too many. You say we want slaves, not educated people. Why, Mr. President? Why are you such an idiot? Why do you insist that if we don't listen to you, we're not going to make it? If we listen to you, we surely will not make it, Mr. President. Now, Mr. President, I'm willing to keep you in the presidency for one reason, because you were elected. I may regret that deeply, but that's a fact of the matter. I regret the fact that you're president because you're too stupid to be president. But, Mr. President, I have a solution for you. I'll take care of this problem for you. You sit in the Oval Office with a group of advisors. Get rid of this bunch of clowns that you've got, these pushing this genocide. You've got some perfectly fine, qualified people in your administration. Just get rid of the bums. And I'm afraid Rahm has to go. Rahm and his brother should go out and try to find what happened to the toilet lid in the King David Hotel when his father blew up that hotel. And there was a British colonel exposed naked to the world because the structure had crumbled around him because of this lousy bombing job done by the Obama, the Emanuel family. And there he is. The plumbing is holding up this bathtub. The colonel is naked in the bathtub, exposed to all kinds of ridicule because of his British proportions and characteristics. But where's the toilet lid? What happened to the toilet lid? I think, Rahm, you and your brother ought to go out and find that toilet lid. Or at least give us a decent report of what happened to it. We don't need the Emanuel family in our government. We don't need Orzad. We don't need a lot of others. But particularly, we don't need anybody who's associated with this health care policy of this president. They must go, and they must go suddenly. Now, your problem, Mr. President, is now to pay attention to what I can do and some other people can do to advise your government. You will sit safely protected in the Oval Office because I don't want anybody to harm you in any way. We're going to protect you against your former British friends who will want to kill you over this issue. We're going to protect you. The full resources of the United States are going to protect your person as president. You will sit safely in the Oval Office by every means we can use to accomplish that. Don't worry about that. We'll treat you in a very friendly, kindly, respectful way. We will not have you announce any policy that you have not been presented with. You will simply say, you don't have to understand the policy, you can simply say, I accept the guidance of my friends here. On that basis, we have people in the wings of government, outside government, who, to my knowledge, are willing to step forward, replace that bunch of clowns associated with the Obama health care policy and similar kinds of things, and put together a program for doing what? The first thing we have to do is we've got an immediate situation coming up in the month of October, November, beyond. An absolutely desperate situation for people who are running out of, in vast numbers, the last shred of unemployment insurance, the last shred of support for the means of existence, facing a disease, an epidemic disease, which is highly dangerous, when the Obama administration is trying to destroy all the very means we require to deal with epidemic disease. We're dealing with a demoralization of the U.S. population, which is losing confidence in itself and confidence in the future. This is what we have to concentrate on. We have to create real employment. Not real employment and make work, but real employment in some kind of production work, the way Roosevelt did in the Depression years in the beginning. We have to put people back to work. If we don't have the work for them, yes, we have to provide unemployment compensation to keep them alive and keep them in condition and keep their dignity above all. We've got to save communities which are no longer productive, put them back into productivity. We're going to concentrate largely on basic economic infrastructure, physical infrastructure of a type that's necessary for the foundation of industry. Now, when you build large-scale infrastructure programs, you also create a lot of private employment. Because when you have a major contract, a government contract, for building a piece of infrastructure, what do? You call in private firms as bidders on contracts to service the completion of this work. And in that way, wherever you put in, like a transportation project, for example, or some other project which is a government project, you immediately stimulate employment of this type in the vicinity. People who have skills, who have small businesses or something of that kind of skill, who can bid on the job and do the job. We've got to do that fast. The first thing we have to do is to do enough of it to convince the people out there that that's what we intend to do. You know, once they can, we go think back to the experience as I saw it and others saw it back in the 1930s. The first thing to do, you've got to rebuild the confidence of those people out there who are feeling desperate in themselves. You've got to rebuild confidence in those communities which are affected by the desolation which is being caused now. You've got to create productive employment, Mr. President. Not green employment, productive employment. You have to fix up the Ohio River, which is no longer functioning because of neglect. You've got to fix up the Mississippi River. You've got to build up the Missouri River. You've got to build up the Oglala Aquifer in the West if you want agriculture in the future. There are many things to do. Get cracking at it. Pick a few of these projects. Get them started. Correlate the way you start these projects with the way you locate revitalization of employment in industries and local communities, as we used to do. Look at a map of the United States. Go state by state. Cooperate with the state officials. Map the problem. Decide where you need the social effect of employment. And find the form of employment that fits the program and make sure they get a share of it there. We want to have an increase by about 20% of employment of the people of the United States who, over the immediate period ahead. We want them to feel that is a Christmas present and a New Year's greeting for a change in the way things are going. The American people are trusting, and if you show respect for them and respect for their needs and a sense of justice, they will trust you for a certain period of time. And they're now in a mood. We're in a mass strike mode in this country, Mr. President, and the country doesn't like you, Mr. President. In matter of fact, they're coming to hate you, Mr. President. They're not going to do violence to you, but they hate you nonetheless. You are a symbol of the suffering you've imposed upon them. And you've got to prove that you're a better man than that. And we'll help you succeed if you consent to do that. We'll keep you in the White House. You'll stay there. You'll be protected. You will be consulted on every question that comes up that you should be consulted on. But you're going to listen to your advisors. And the advisors are going to be a lot more competent than you are. And you're going to learn a lot. For the first time in your life, you're going to really learn a lot that you need to know. And you will walk out of that job with the pride that while you were president, whether you were qualified to be president or not, that under your presidency, the job was done. And you can take pride in that. That's what I can give you. It's the best I can give you. Junk your present program. It's idiotic, it's completely stupid, and it's criminal. Stop it. Mr. President, for the first time in your life, be a mensch. Okay.